If Joe Biden's election is the end of an isolationist United States, then Europe will be looking at the president-elect with as much interest as any corner of the world. So who's got the most to gain, or perhaps lose, from a new relationship with the world's most powerful man? This is Roundtable. Welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. From NATO to trade to climate talks to an EU without the United Kingdom. Does the 46th president want to undo much of what his predecessor did in Europe? Or is he okay with some, if not all, of the disruption caused by Donald Trump? Despite the Trump administration refusing to acknowledge the election victory of President-elect Joe Biden, it has been warmly received by top EU officials. European Council President Charles Michel says he'll invite Joe Biden to talk to EU heads of state and government by video link, perhaps even before his inauguration in January. From the perspective of EU officials, Donald Trump has made life difficult in almost every policy area, from security to climate change. While trade has been one of the most contentious issues for the two sides over the last 4 years. Joe Biden's win was perhaps a welcome development for the EU team negotiating a post-Brexit deal, as it's likely to put added pressure on the UK to strike an agreement. But what will the Biden presidency really mean for relations across the Atlantic? And we can welcome back to Roundtable all three of our guests today. In Chicago, Paul Poast, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science, the University of Chicago. Pieter Cleppe is in Brussels, Policy Analyst at Property Rights Alliance. And in London, Anthony Dworkin, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. I'm going to go round you all one by one, but I will preface that by saying, look, he is probably going to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. We can sort of leave that one out of this. But Anthony, if you were in his shoes, what would be top of the list when it comes to resetting, changing relations with Europe?
Well, I think what Europeans are really looking for is an administration in the United States that treats Europe as an ally and not as a potential competitor or even as an enemy. And that really was the kind of language that we heard from the Trump administration. So I think the most important thing is to kind of recreate this sense that the United States and Europe are bound together by historic ties, by shared values, and by a shared vision of the world. They might disagree on this policy or that policy, but their basic orientation is to work together as allies and listen to each other and respect each other. If Biden does that, that will already be a significant change.
And that's called diplomacy.
That is indeed a word for it, yep.
Okay, Paul, top of your to-do list if you are inside Mr. Biden's head when it comes to resetting with Europe.
So first of all, I would agree exactly with what was just said, that you can expect a changed tone, no more diplomacy by tweet. As far as I know, Joe Biden doesn't actually use his own Twitter. So I think that's something that'll be a relief to many people. And in fact, the tone and the perception of improved relations could be such that Joe Biden, like President Obama, might need to expect a trip to Oslo coming along fairly soon. But I think that besides the change in tone, another key change will be, and admittedly, this one's subject to a bit of uncertainty at the moment, but it will be a change in presence. One of the big shortcomings of the Trump administration has been its inability to fully staff the diplomatic ranks, both in the State Department, in terms of embassies, and as a result, it's not that the U.S. hasn't been around for the big issues, say like a Ukraine, but it's that the U.S. hasn't been there, hasn't been present on a day-to-day basis. And so that's going to be a big change coming with the Biden administration. Now, where I say there's some uncertainty is, of course, right now, the Biden team hasn't been able to fully start the transition. And until they can fully start that transition, it's going to be difficult to begin staffing these diplomatic ranks. But once that can begin, that's going to be a key driver of kind of this new change or this change in perception about US-European relations.
Okay, you all know the rules. You can jump in at any time, but that's after we've been round the table, if you like. So, Peter, I'm going to bring you in. You are in Brussels. If you were in the EU's seat, what would you be looking for in terms of change?
Well, I think we're heading to a period where the United States will once again be a driver for political globalism. If we look back in history, we've seen wild swings in that regard, with the US being very isolationist at times, and the United States, like, for example, after the First World War, being an absolute forceful driver for political globalism. In practice, I think this will mean, apart from what you mentioned, rejoining the climate Accords of Paris, also the United States rejoining the World Health Organization, and also I would say factually rejoining the World Trade Organization, because the US never, of course, left this body, but it has been, you could say, obstructing some of its proceedings by not nominating arbitrators, for example. So I think that's actually gonna be quite a big change.
I've got my own to-do list here, and one of those elements is what you've just mentioned, and that is trade. How's that going to change, Peter, with the EU?
Well, for a start, as I mentioned, I think Joe Biden will at least try to make the World Trade Organization operational again. But then also the current conflicts that, of course, predate Trump, for example, on US and EU imposing tariffs when it comes to Boeing and Airbus. I think Biden will make an effort to solve those existing conflicts. And I would not be surprised if he also will at least try to restart the talks on a US-EU trade deal. I'm skeptical of the success, unfortunately. I think it would be great to have such a trade deal, but I would not be surprised if the same impediments come to the fore, basically protectionism in both Europe and the US. Those are the big impediments. But I do think Biden will play a positive role in at least trying to get back to the table on that important issue. Also, if you look at what has been happening over the weekend, when we had a very big trade accord in Asia, which includes China and Australia and a whole range of East Asian countries. I wouldn't say it's a big win for China, but it's definitely a big win for East Asia, because they basically gain more easy trade access. So I'm not surprised that the response of the Biden administration will be to strengthen ties with its old ally, Europe.
Anthony, since you happen to be in London and we're talking trade, what about a post-Brexit Britain? Will Joe Biden be rushing to do a deal with Boris Johnson?
Well, Joe Biden has already made it very clear that he is a proud Irish American. And there's no doubt that the fate of the Good Friday Agreement and the prevention of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is going to be a key point for this presidency. So I think we'll have to see what terms the UK ends up leaving the EU on. And if there is a kind of acrimonious division and Boris Johnson follows through on this potential threat of pulling back from the withdrawal agreement and reestablishing some sort of hard border, that could have consequences that I think would prevent any quick US-UK trade agreement.
Going beyond,
there's been a lot of speculation.
Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say there's been a lot of speculation about how Biden's apparent distrust of Johnson, perhaps seeing Johnson as a kind of populist in the mold of Donald Trump, and what seems to be his opposition to Brexit. Is that going to affect UK-US relations more broadly? And I think that may be overstated. I think Biden will want to work with all the partners he can. So, I think overall the relations should be okay, but that Irish border question is going to be a really important one to watch.
I suppose it's out of the same mold as your answer, but I was going to say, and I will still say, if the UK is the first country that Joe Biden visits, will that be very significant?
Well, there's always a lot of attention to these kinds of issues. I would be surprised if the UK was the first country that Joe Biden visits. I think, Europe will be an important partner, and I think he'll want to keep the UK and Europe aligned. But, it could be that he'll be going first to Brussels or to Germany. I think perhaps that kind of symbolism is it's a kind of goes with an old-fashioned view of the special relationship that I think really won't guide the Biden administration's practical steps in any real way at all. But the UK will still be an important partner.
Okay, maybe more for old hacks like you and me, Anthony, back in the day. Paul, let me come to you. Security cooperation with Europe. How good is that at the moment, and what might change, if anything?
So one thing that I would just add is to pick up on where Joe Biden will visit first. I actually think it won't be anywhere in Europe. I think it'll be either Canada or Mexico. That's one key thing is we kind of take for granted, or maybe because there's been so much focus on Asia and Europe, we forget about how poor relations are right now between our next door neighbors. And so I actually think that'll be the first visit, will be Canada and Mexico. But moving back to transatlantic relations, in many ways, the Trump administration is just an exaggeration of really 70 years of transatlantic relations. I like to talk about what I call the quadrilemma of transatlantic defense, which is that you have the Americans complaining about free riding European allies. You have the Europeans fearing American abandonment. Then you have the Americans opposing the Europeans trying to assert a more independent defense. And then you have the Europeans complaining about overbearing Americans. We've seen this for 70 years. It was just exaggerated during the Trump administration, largely going back to what I was talking about in terms of the tone, in terms of the lack of day-to-day presence that can help to kind of keep relations on a good footing despite these bigger issues regarding burden sharing. But those aren't going to go away. Those are still going to be there. The Biden administration, probably even more so than the Trump administration, views Russia as a threat. And so as a result, they're going to say, look, NATO needs to be able to stand up to this threat. They need to be able to stand up on their own. And so though the tone will be different, you will still continue to see some push by the Biden administration on Germany to raise their spending. And so that's not going to change.
You may well have jumped the gun a little bit there, Paul, because some people may well have been wondering why I hadn't mentioned NATO, but that was going to come under the heading of what things might not change. But Peter, since we're talking about Germany, what about personalities? We don't know who the next German chancellor is going to be. How was the relationship between Donald Trump and Angela Merkel, who of course will be leaving office?
Well, it's not exactly a secret that Merkel is delighted, of course, to have Joe Biden as president in the United States. Now, I do think that these personality issues, that we should not exaggerate them, or that we should not exaggerate the importance of personality when it comes to something as important as the relationship between, on the one hand, the United States, and the other, Germany and Europe. As the previous speaker said, I mean, the US has largely justified frustration about European countries not properly coming up with sufficient defense capacity, but this was translated by Donald Trump as not sufficiently spending. I would take issue with that. I think we do not necessarily increase spending, but we should definitely spend much better. Now, specifically, one big concern that will have to be solved between Biden and Merkel before she goes, because she's not gone yet, is the issue of Nord Stream, the gas pipeline between Germany and Russia that is deeply troubling Poland and the Baltic states. So I would not be surprised if Angela Merkel will turn out to be less than less happy than expected with Joe Biden when it appears that he's taken an even harder line than Donald Trump when it comes to this particular project.
Since I've been hijacked here, Anthony, we'll talk about NATO. It was going to come later on. Donald Trump did get more money out of the Europeans for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Joe Biden will want to see that continue, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I think this is, and that, remember, that didn't start with Donald Trump. Obama also wanted the Europeans to do more for their own defense. And, you know, as the other guest said, this has been a kind of long-running theme of US-European relations. But I actually think in some interesting ways, the situation post-Trump will be different. And I think, you know, it took Donald Trump to really force the Europeans to confront the fact that they shouldn't and can't always rely on the United States. And, you know, for the first time, they had an administration that they simply couldn't, you know, be sure that it was going to be there for Europe if necessary. And so that kind of kick-started a debate in Europe about what Europeans like to call, you know, European sovereignty or strategic autonomy. It means being able to act a bit more independently in global affairs. And now that that discussion, you know, is finally underway, it's not going to stop just because Joe Biden is back in the White House. And one reason for that, I think, is, you know, once bitten, twice shy. I mean, if you can have one Trump, you can have another. And indeed, it could be that Donald Trump is going to run again in 4 years. So I think you will see the Europeans, you know, looking to be more assertive and more self-reliant globally. But of course, that's not going to be at a military level where they can really, you know, divorce themselves from the United States. So that tie and that reliance will continue to some degree, but there'll be more independence.
Yeah, I guess that's what you meant when I saw in your notes. You said you think the United States will expect Europe to lead more. Be more specific, if you can, in what particular areas?
I would say that's going to be particularly in areas that matter more to Europe than to the United States. And that's what Europeans call the European neighborhood. You know, some parts of North Africa and the Sahel, that kind of desert area, you know, underneath Algeria, where there's been a lot of kind of terrorism coming out of. You know, some parts of former Soviet Union, whether it's the Caucasus or you know, the areas between Europe and Russia, or the Western Balkans, you know, these kinds of areas. I think the US is really going to be pulling back. It's not going to be involved. It's going to be looking to Europe to, you know, pick up the slack and carry a bit more weight in those particular areas. I think on global issues like China, which we haven't talked about too much yet, the US will be looking for Europe to be, you know, to be pulling its weight as a partner, but they'll want to be acting together there.
Paul, going back to a little bit of what Anthony was just saying about the United States pulling back from certain areas, I had notes down here on Belarus and Ukraine, particularly tied to Russia. Does that mean perhaps that Joe Biden won't be that interested in that area?
I think it was a great point that was just raised, because remember that a major, I wouldn't want to use the word failure, but a major point of acrimonious relations between the Europeans and the Americans during Obama's term was Libya. And about the fact that this was something that was pushed by the European NATO allies, and the United States said, we'll play a support role. Now, the reason why this became an issue was exactly to the point that was just raised. This wasn't considered a core area of U.S. interest. And moreover, the United States ended up having to carry a lot of the military burden for that operation. And of course, Biden was vice president during that. So I think that this is kind of going to be a lesson learned by the Biden administration to say, okay, maybe if the Europeans want to take action in areas, be it Northern Africa, parts of the Balkans, parts of the near abroad, Russia's near abroad, as it's referred to, maybe the U.S. is going to take lessons from Libya and say, okay, you can do that, but we're not going to be supporting you to the same level. And that's going to be less to do with Trump and the concerns about Trump, and that's going to be more about lessons learned during the Obama administration. So I do think that there's validity to this idea that the US will be pulling back if the Europeans want to take actions in areas that aren't core US interest.
We've got the former White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, saying things will warm, but they're unlikely to go back all the way to what they were before the Trump administration, because the president really did tap into a couple of things. Paul, you first, and then we'll go around the table again. Have we covered all of those areas with NATO and interventionist policies, or are there other areas that will stay pretty much the same?
Well, I think what was just highlighted, we haven't talked much about, is kind of what does the US-European relationship mean globally? And in particular, when we say that, we're really referring to what does this mean with respect to China? As was raised this past weekend, there's this new trade pact that's been signed. It's still questionable about how fully meaningful that trade pact is, but the reality is that China is a party of it, even though they didn't lead it. It was really an ASEAN initiative, but they didn't lead that, but they are a party to it. The United States is not. And if you go back to the US, had an opportunity to do that with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And they pulled out of that. So this is one area that's a big concern to the US. And I think for me, it's to think about, well, how can the US say, all right, well, since we're losing this foothold in Asia, how can we reinforce our standing in Europe? And then how can that in turn allow us to, say, create comprehensive trade agreements or a comprehensive security arrangement with other states in East Asia that are maybe also viewing China as a potential competitor or potential threat? And so I think that's one big area that the Biden administration is going to be thinking about, is how to leverage transatlantic relations into Asia.
Peter, I noticed that in the notes I got given on your thoughts, you said that Biden is likely to be more interventionist than Donald Trump was. In what areas in particular that might affect the European Union, or Europe as a continent as a whole?
Well, we've seen that in history, Biden has been quite open to military interventions. For example, he supported the Iraq war, which turned out to be, I would say, quite disastrous for Europe. You could argue that ISIS has been born out of that intervention. Then, of course, he was vice president when Obama indeed was dragged into Libya. But because the Europeans, or more in particular France and the UK, were not able to militarily complete this without US support. So indeed, also this has not been a great thing. The destabilization of Libya has been a very bad thing for Europe in many respects. At the moment, we have Turkish and Russian forces present there in Europe's southern European underbelly. Now, what to expect? Obama was dragged into Europe also when it comes to finance. He was keen to have a so-called pivot to Asia until European banks were in deep trouble, and this then endangered the stability of American banks. So then Tim Geithner had to come to Berlin to lobby for Germany bailing out Southern Europe. What does this lead Biden going now? I mean, what will happen now? I think it's hard to predict. I think he's gonna engage as much as possible in Europe, supporting political globalism. But whenever there's a deep crisis, for example, with Iran, if negotiations that I think Biden will take up again lead to nothing, I do think Biden will be quite open to, I would say, the neocons that are really not either Democrats or Republicans, but that you could define as people in the foreign policy establishment that are quite open to military interventions. And I think Biden is more open to that than Trump.
I'm going to move from Brussels. I'm sorry about this, Peter, but we're coming towards the end of the program and go to Anthony. Of course, the 45th presidency isn't over, and it is a long time, Anthony, since you and I were in Washington, a totally different era, working together, looking at a totally different president. Have you ever seen anything like the last 4 years, and are we going to be bored by Biden?
I don't think anyone has ever seen anything like the last 4 years in terms of American politics. It's been extraordinary. And the world has been kind of focused and fixated on what's happened in Washington and what Trump is doing. And, I think that has been fascinating and disastrous. It's been disastrous in terms of American foreign policy. It's been, very bad in terms of America's alliances and America's participation in these international institutions that we've talked about.
Sorry to be brief, but will we be bored by Biden, Anthony? We've got 15 seconds. You'll know all about deadlines.
We will be bored by Biden, and that's a good thing, because it'll be better for America and better for the world than the kind of excitement that Trump has provided.
Thank you very much indeed. Great to have you all back on Roundtable. Thanks for your expertise. And we'll probably see you all again. That's if you're prepared to come back. From me, David Foster, and all those who put this Roundtable together, thank you for watching. And we hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.